Greetings and welcome to my latest video documenting my trip across America this summer. In this video, I'm going to do a quick review of the trip itself, talking a little bit about each state that I traveled, and then talk about the highs and lows, the bests and the worsts of the trip. There'll be a lot more detail around that sort of thing in the next videos that I do, which will be reviews of all my camping equipment, reviews of my bike parts, talking about the different places, the different trails that I was on, and giving my evaluations of all those. But this is just going to be hitting some of the highs and doing kind of an overview of the trip again. As I mentioned earlier, I spent about a year and a half planning this trip, designing the bike, building the bike, planning the route, that sort of stuff. I knew from the very beginning that there were going to be a lot of changes once I actually got on the road. The old adage about battle plans never last past the first engagement, or something like that, whatever that quote is. Anyway, it proved true on this trip. I knew there was going to be moments of boredom, excitement, good times, bad times, and that was all part of the deal. And I did my very best to just live in the moment and kind of relish each experience, whether it was an up or a down or whatever. And I think I did that pretty well. Originally, I planned to cover about 4,000 miles and 15 states. I ended up doing about 2,000 miles and about 10 states. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened with that. That's not counting the driving that I did. I had a wonderful vacation driving a little bit in Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota. That was cool. But before I get to all the bests and worsts kind of stuff, let's do a quick review of the whole trip, state by state. It started at the Pacific Ocean in Oregon, where Michael and I dipped our wheels in the salt water and headed east. And it wasn't very long into that first day before I met my nemesis. Busy, narrow roads with little or no shoulder and fast trucks. And that became kind of the theme for the next month and a half or so, until I managed to start avoiding that sort of thing. Again, it started in Oregon, and that was the most beautiful state that I think we traveled in. I just loved Oregon. It was beautiful, it was varied, the camping was awesome. Even just walking from a campsite to filter some water out of a creek turned out to be just beautiful. I loved Oregon. It was also the most challenging state in terms of physical exertion. Climbing McKenzie Pass was a big deal. A lot of walk-a-bike, or hike-a-bike, excuse me. And I did more of that at other places, but Oregon, when I was still getting into shape, and McKenzie Pass in particular, was a lot of hike-a-bike. It was beautiful, but it was tiring, to say the least. Also in Oregon, I got over the EFI attitude, every effing inch. Friends of mine said that when they first started bike touring, they felt obligated never to walk their bike, never to get in a car, never to get in a truck, but rather to pedal every effing inch. Well, I got over that pretty early in Oregon. Michael and I were in a bike shop in Eugene, and they kept advising us that there was no good way to bike from there to the McKenzie Pass or beyond. And so we got on a bus and strapped our bikes to the front, and we took a bus about 50 miles from Eugene to Oregon. And that was a good thing. I didn't think so at the time at all, but as I look back, that got me over the EFI attitude and got me more focused on what was really quite doable and less scary. And that turned out to be a good attitude to try to develop. Moving beyond Oregon, next came Idaho, which was kind of like Oregon in terms of the terrain and that sort of stuff, or Eastern Oregon, I should say. And my favorite parts about Idaho easily were meeting up with my old friends from college days, Steve Bryant in Boise and Bob Queenan in Idaho Falls. It was great catching up with them. Loved that. And there was some biking in Idaho too, which was lovely, but my favorite parts were catching up with my friends. I mentioned I skipped Wyoming. I rented a truck and did a little bit of a summer touristy thing on my own, seeing all kinds of cool tourist destinations in Wyoming and Montana and even South Dakota before I made it to Nebraska for the next real biking adventure. I've been really looking forward to Nebraska because of the Cowboy Trail, one of the best known rails to trails in the United States. And love Nebraska, love the little towns, loved the campgrounds that every little town had in their city parks, loved the people that I met there. Oh my gosh, love the people. But the actual Cowboy Trail, the surface was kind of loose, gravelly. Didn't enjoy that a lot. I did most of it, but I often got off onto roads if there was a really good shoulder just to avoid that soft trail surface. And I was hoping that that wasn't going to be the case with all the rails to trails, and sure enough, it was not. So, like Nebraska, loved the people, wasn't crazy about the Cowboy Trail. One other thing that was a bit challenging was getting into Omaha. Turns out that the last few dozen miles getting into Omaha are really hilly. Didn't see that coming. But I got through it, and that led me into Omaha, where I met up with a woman that I'd met back on the trail. She and her sister let me stay in their guest house for a night, and that was some great tour magic. Loved that part of Nebraska. And then onward to Missouri and the Katy Trail. And wow, loved the Katy Trail. The western states were spectacular, the mountains, the snow, the variability of the terrain and all that. But Missouri got to really what I was hoping to find on this trip, and I just loved it once I was on the Katy Trail. The surface was great. I loved riding on it, even when it was a little bit wet. The terrain started to get really green, which reminded me of home, even more so once I got to Pennsylvania, but I love that part about Missouri. Met some cool people, including my friend Raymond, with whom I spent, I guess, 3 days, nights, whatever, on the trail, which were awesome. The only main complaint about the Katy Trail is that the ending is very weak. It should end in St. Charles, because beyond that, it just peters out to nothing. Where it finally finishes, there's not even any road access, much less any amenities or anything like that. It just kind of ends in the middle of nowhere. St. Charles was the climactic part of the Katy Trail in Missouri. From there, I decided to skip Illinois and Indiana because I couldn't figure out a good way across them without just scary roads. So loaded my bike up and drove it to Cincinnati. The Ohio to Erie Trail, awesome. Starting in Cincinnati and going all the way to Lake Erie. I never planned to take it all the way that far north because I wanted to go to Pittsburgh. But the part of it that I did was paved, smooth. Even though part of it was on a Sunday and there were a lot of people out walking and stuff, it was never too crowded. Great trail. Lots of places to get off the trail for food, snacks, water, all that, bathrooms. Great. But there's no place to camp. At least not any place where I wanted to camp the whole time I was on it from Cincinnati to Columbus. So while I was searching for campground in Xenia, my friend from high school, Pam, and her husband picked me up, and I got to spend a night with them. That was awesome. But I really love camping, and there was just no camping near Xenia, and certainly not near Columbus. So again, a hotel night. And from there, I again loaded my bike up because there's no good way to get from Columbus to Pittsburgh on a bicycle, and drove the bike to Pittsburgh to start the Gap Trail, GAP, Great Allegheny Passage. Wow. Start was a little bit rough in downtown Pittsburgh. You're on streets with construction, and it's just not really easy to get from the point where the three rivers are, the Monongahela and Allegheny, meeting to form the Ohio, which is where the trail starts. But by the time I was 15 or 20 miles outside of Pittsburgh, I was on a wonderful trail, and I really, really liked the Gap Trail. And now we're getting into the terrain that really felt like home. I'm in the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up near Asheville, North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains, and this really had a home kind of feeling. The trail surface was wonderful, bridges and tunnels that were fun. I just can't say enough positive things about that rail to trail, the Allegheny Gap Trail, of the Great Allegheny Passage. Loved it. Only bad part was that on day one, I lost a pannier. I think it was me that I didn't snap it on well enough when I was in Pittsburgh. But by the time I got to my first night, 60 miles down the road, or trail, I looked down to see that one of my panniers was missing, which was good and bad news. The bad news was it had crucial camping equipment like my stove, my sleeping pad, the puffy jacket that I used as a pillow. So I wasn't able to camp anymore for the whole rest of the trip. I couldn't replace my camping gear. The good news was that was the more expendable of my two rear panniers. The one on the left had my iPad, my extra money, some of my clothes, just a lot of stuff that I would have been really worse off without. So thank goodness that I lost the one that I did. Still, it was unfortunate that I wasn't able to camp anymore because of that. But loved the Gap Trail. Cool bed and breakfast that I stayed in along the way. Wasn't planning on it, but for instance, that first night was in a horrible little motel, but the second night was at the River's Edge Bed and Breakfast and Cafe in Confluence. Great place, great people. The cafe was wonderful. The Airbnb, it's not an Airbnb. The bed and breakfast itself was very nice, and I'll do a review of that, but that was awesome. And then once you get to Cumberland, the Allegheny Gap Trail leads right into the C&O Towpath Trail, which then goes West Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, DC. I guess it doesn't officially touch in Virginia. I did, but it doesn't. But anyway, that led me to the C&O Canal Trail. Great history along the C&O Canal Trail, Civil War history, Revolutionary War history, Harper's Ferry, Antietam, all the way down into the Washington, D.C. area. Great history. The locks, the viaducts, the lock houses, really neat. I learned an awful lot about that part of the history while I was on the trail. But the C&O Canal Trail does not have a great surface, not very well maintained, especially compared to the Katy Trail and the Gap Trail. When it's wet, it's muddy. And when it's muddy, it's very muddy. And that was a challenge and uncomfortable. Mud inside my fenders. There's no good water along the C&O Canal. There's very few places where you can conveniently get off the trail to go to a store and buy snacks and get some water and that sort of thing. Harper's Ferry was an exception. But for the most part, water is very sparse. Cell coverage was very poor, and the mud. But towards the very end, the Western Maryland Railroad Trail runs parallel to the C&O Canal Trail for 28 miles. It's paved, and it was lovely. Well, it was rooted. There were roots growing under it in some places that made it very bumpy, but it sure beat being back up on the muddy C&O Canal Trail that day. Also, as you get close to DC, even on a weekday afternoon, e-bikes, crowded people. It was tough riding my bike. I was forever ringing my bell and saying, excuse me, because people on their e-bikes with their cell phones just weren't paying attention. Once I got to DC, I did the usual touristy stuff, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Watergate, the Kennedy Center, the Pentagon. Even though I'd lived there for almost 30 years, it was cool seeing those sites again. If you ever do that, I strongly recommend that you take at least a couple of days. In addition to those sites, it's certainly worth seeing the White House, the Capitol, the National Zoo, the National Cathedral. There's just a lot to see and do in Washington, D.C. And that took me to Mount Vernon, where I wrapped up my ride. This is my ceremonial dipping of my front tire in tidal water, if not the actual beach. Woohoo! So, now let's get to a few of my favorites. My favorite bike part, my Schwalbe Marathon Plus tires, and you'll hear why in a minute. My favorite camping gear, my Zen Bivy sleep system. My favorite state, Oregon. My favorite trail, can't choose. It's either the Gap Trail or the Katy Trail. They were both fabulous, and I'd love to do them both again, and I hope I will next year, at least the Katy Trail. My favorite campsite was Alder Springs in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon. It was just so beautiful, and even just hiking 100 yards or so up a hill to get some spring water filtered, just magical. Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. My favorite indoor nights, not in a tent, were a tie between the hostel in Oregon, where it was a biking hostel, where Michael and I met a couple of other thru bikers, and the in the bed and breakfast that I just mentioned in Confluence, Pennsylvania, the River's Edge bed and breakfast was just awesome. Okay, some lessons learned. I don't like busy roads, but I do love rails to trails. There's no traffic on them. They are flat. They've generally got great surfaces. There's generally very good camping along them. I thought I was going to be a big fan of rails to trails. Now I'm a huge fan of rails to trails. Just love it. I also learned, thanks to my followers on this YouTube channel, that I should do more photography of scenery, and I will do that going forward. In fact, I'm about to start doing my whole series of review videos, and I'm going to try to do those from some picturesque places. Also learned that I need an action camera. Michael had a GoPro with us for as long as he was with me, but after Oregon and part of Idaho, he swung north to spend the rest of his vacation with friends in Montana and Wyoming, having some fabulous adventures on his own. But that left me with just my phone and my drone. I really needed an action camera. I've since got one, and I'll do a review of that for you in an upcoming video. I learned that people are even more awesome than I thought. Not only weren't they bad, I never got honked at, I never got yelled at, as you sometimes do when you're on a bicycle, sometimes slowing down traffic. But man, the tour magic, the wonderful things people did for us that you see documented in my other videos were just fantastic. I thought I was going to enjoy the camping. I loved the camping. I need to camp more and do fewer roads and gravel especially, and more rails to trails and more camping. I learned that one should put an ID of some sort into every bag because you never know what you're going to forget or is going to fall off along the way. And I didn't, and I lost a pannier with some pretty valuable stuff in it. Lesson learned. I had never before journaled in my life. I'd never kept a diary. I really enjoyed that, and it was really useful in terms of reliving the trip, both for these videos and just generally. So I will journal on adventures from now on. I got reinforced the idea that one should buy really good equipment. You'll hear in a couple minutes about my fortunate stuff, that my equipment stood me in very good stead. Just great camping equipment and biking equipment, and that really paid off. I learned that when one does a trip like this, one can get into shape. I was in good shape to start with. I was in very good shape by the end of the first month. I even lost about 17 pounds trying to keep it off. So that was awesome. I learned quite a bit about droning and photography generally. I've got an awful lot more to learn. I should probably take a class or two. I'm getting better, but I learned stuff on the trip, and I've got a lot more to learn in that regard. Here's a lesson for you. Stop and eat ice cream whenever possible. Calories were not an issue, so I had ice cream cones. Even if it was just a gas station, I go in and get a Klondike bar or something like that. Oh, that was so good. That was just magical. Another lesson learned, when you come to a lake or a river, if at all possible, get in it. I've just really loved the times that I did get into a couple of lakes and the Potomac River, and I wish I'd even done that more. I learned that hills are hard, and with an 80-pound bike, they're even harder. And I don't particularly care for that. I did quite a bit of hike-a-bike, where I got off my bike and pushed it up really steep hills. Now, on the one hand, every few hours getting off the bike and walking it a little bit was a nice break, and I appreciated and enjoyed that. But um, generally, hiking or trying to pedal an 80-pound bike, no matter how low the gears, up really steep hills is something I'm not a big fan of. I was really fortunate on this trip. So fortunate, so lucky in so many ways. Here's a few of them. I put together a super repair kit and first aid kit. Almost never needed either one of them. A couple of band-aids, I think, out of the first aid kit. The scissors, which I use for other purposes than first aid. Repair kit, I tightened up all the bolts on my bike every now and then, but almost never needed my repair kit. I never really had a breakdown. I had a couple of things that broke, like my kickstand and my seat, but they never stopped me. I was able to quickly fix them or get a replacement part or just ignore it and go on my way. Didn't even have a flat, not one single flat, the whole 2,000-ish miles. Wow, that was so lucky. Unlike, was it yesterday? Yesterday in Kentucky, where I was chased by 2 dogs, the whole trip across the United States was never chased by a dog once. I was ready for wildlife encounters, had my bear spray, never got chased by a bear. So that was very cool. I never got too cold except for one morning coming down a hill. I guess it was still Oregon. It was really, really cold that one morning. I couldn't even feel my fingers at one point. But that was it. Otherwise, I was never too cold, and the cold weather was great for sleeping. I was also never really too hot. The hottest day of the trip by far was the last day when I was going from Washington, D.C. down to Mount Vernon. That was also the most humid day. So not even any inconvenient precipitation. I got drizzled on once or twice. There was hail, but I was in my tent. And the really rainy days, I managed to stay in a hotel an extra day for a recovery day. So never really rained on. Wow. No bugs. I had a net thing that you wear over a hat. Never had to break it out. I put bug spray on, I think, once on my lower legs when I was sitting at a picnic table. Not even any bugs on this trip. Not even any bed bugs. No real scares. No wildlife scares, as I just mentioned. The traffic was frightening, but it wasn't startling scared. It was just, oh my God, here comes another truck. Pull over to the side sometimes and just stop. So very, very fortunate trip. Really, really lucky. So that's it for this video. Coming up, I'll be doing videos where I'll review my camping equipment, where I'll review my bike, I'll review the places I stayed, the trails, that sort of stuff. Lots of videos are coming, short videos, which will be doing reviews and stuff like that. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this one. Please like and subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you in the next one. Onward.